So thank you for joining us and for wanting to become more involved and knowledgeable about what our priorities are.
Thank you so much. Just one quick little housekeeping item. We will be doing a Q&A at the end after Edna has finished her presentation. So if you have questions that come up during the presentation, you can type them into the chat and we will be compiling them on our end, and we will make sure that your questions get answered at the end of Edna's presentation. And just another reminder for anybody who has joined us after I gave the interpretation instructions, we are conducting this event bilingually in English and in Spanish, and you have to select your language. At the bottom, in the menu at the bottom, there is an icon that you can click on to select English or Spanish. And Edna, I think we're ready to get started.
Okie doke. So Allie is my slide changer. So in order to kind of understand the priorities, we have to sort of set the landscape for the 87th session. And this slide in particular just got changed this week because the comptroller issued a new revenue estimate on Monday. Back in June, he predicted, or he estimated that Texas would face a $4.6 billion deficit. He changed that to $1 billion, which is good news, but it's for the current 2-year budget cycle, which we are in the middle of, and it ends in August, at the end of August of this year. And this deficit will determine which bills pass or die, which bills get a hearing or don't get a hearing, and what receives funding. The other important thing that's not on this slide is that for the next biennium, which the legislature will have to set a budget for, the comptroller estimates that the state will have a $6.3 billion, well, the state will have $6.3 billion less than this cycle. So I think that we'll be pretty much okay for this biennium that we're in right now. But it's the next biennium that's we're going to have to look out for and be a little bit more concerned about. Next slide, please. So everybody knows about House Bill 3 that passed last session. It was a very comprehensive bill, did a lot of things. I'm not going to go into every single item that it did, but most importantly, it increased the state share of education funding to 45%. Prior to this session, to last session, the state share was around 36%, and the rest was shouldered by local taxpayers. They increased the basic allotment by over $1,000 per student, and they provided an additional $6.55 billion for Texas schools. Next slide, Allie. And that increase in funding enabled Austin ISD to grant $48 million in raises. HB3 required that a certain percentage of increased funding be used for increases in salary for teachers, counselors, and librarians. And it also required that those with 5 or more years of experience receive a higher raise. So in Austin ISD, our teachers, counselors, and librarians with more than 5 years of experience received a 7% raise, and all other employees received a 6% raise. And in addition to the raises, special education teachers received a $500 stipend, and bilingual teachers received a $1,000 stipend. So that's sort of as a backdrop for our legislative priorities. And it's not surprising that sustainable funding for House Bill 3 is at the top of our priorities. And it's at the top of the priorities for almost all school districts in the state of Texas. And part of what HB3 did was, and one of the goals was to decrease recapture. And it decreased it slightly for us, and we hope that it will continue to decrease our recapture payments. And that it continues the state's share at 45% or more of funding public education. Next slide. So another one of the board's priorities, and let me sort of back up and give some background on how we develop our priorities. We usually, well, we always actually go to staff and ask them for their input. We have a legislative committee of the board. We have our senior staff look at the priorities. And we normally have quite a few priorities because I've learned in the last 3 sessions that I've worked for the district that when I go to the Capitol or when a legislator calls me or legislative staff call me and they say, what's the district's position on this bill? And if the board has not adopted a position on in a particular area, I can't say basically I have to say we don't have a position on it. So I try to be very thoughtful about what I think may come up during the session that we should have a position on and include it in our priorities. This time, the board highlighted 5 major priorities, and then as an appendix to the priorities, adopted 28 additional priorities. And I'm going to go over some of them this evening. But these priorities here are among the sort of the top 5. We learned during this pandemic that we must connect Texas families to broadband because they're losing out on educational opportunities. So this is one of our major priorities, is to connect all Texas families to broadband. Another priority in the top 5 is to eliminate disproportionate effects of K-12 suspensions and expulsions on Black and Hispanic students. And then among rounding up the top 5 is opposing. We oppose vouchers. We oppose any form of vouchers, whether it's tax credits, tuition reimbursements, etc. We oppose any unfunded mandates, and we oppose limits on local control. And so in the appendix that I mentioned that has the 28 additional priorities, they fall into these 5 major categories, and you can see how many we have in accountability and assessment. We have 6. We have 5 in charter schools, 10 in education funding, etc. So I'm going to go over some of these priorities, and you can also find them on our website. If you go to austinisd.org//legislature, you can find all of these listed. Next, Allie. Okay, so under accountability and assessment, we support an accountability system that fairly and accurately evaluates student quality and student performance and does not penalize districts for factors outside their control, such as COVID-19. Now, this is not how the priority is worded specifically, but this is sort of the sentiment of the priorities. And we also support an accountability system that includes multiple measures of student performance and growth and not just test scores. Next slide. We also support an accountability system, as I said earlier, that doesn't rely too heavily on standardized tests. And then we have a specific priority that is about Rosedale, which is our school that enroll students who receive special ed and who have very intensive cognitive and or medical needs. Rosedale is rated just like every other campus, and we always have to appeal that rating. So last session we worked with Representative Gina Hinojosa, and she introduced a bill. It got a hearing. Unfortunately, it was a little bit too late in the session to get the bill passed, but fortunately, she has filed that bill again. So this is a very kind of local bill for us. There may be a few other districts that have a Rosedale kind of a school. Next slide, please. Charter schools. We have 5 priorities dealing with charter schools. And I had the opportunity this last year to work on some fiscal impact statements regarding charter schools and how proposed new charters would affect Austin ISD. So I'm fairly familiar with the process. And the first priority that's listed here is to increase the transparency, notice, and opportunity to provide input before a charter can be approved or expanded. In Texas, there is ample, well, there is opportunity to provide information on a new charter application. But once a school has a charter and they want to expand and open more campuses or increase their enrollment, they just file an amendment with the commissioner, and we get very little notice, and there's really hardly any opportunity to give input. And those expansions are pretty much as important as the original charter. So, so this is an important priority. And in fact, there's already been a bill filed. There's been a few bills filed that support this particular priority. I'll tell you the sort of the charter champions in the House are Gina Hinojosa, Representative Gina Hinojosa, and Representative Mary Gonzalez of El Paso, and she has served on the Public Ed Committee for several sessions. On this particular priority, Representative Dickey Goodwin, who represents Austin, has filed House Bill 438 that supports this priority. And Representative Gonzalez has filed House Bill 944, which supports this priority. The next bullet on this slide is says that we support funding charter schools at the same level as school districts located in the same area. So charter schools receive a little over $1,000 more per student than school district students receive. And you may have a charter school that is originally maybe located in McAllen, Texas, and then they expand to Austin. This particular priority says that that charter school should be funded at the same level as the Austin School District schools are funded. Also, as background, charter schools receive more funding because they receive the small and mid-size district allotment. So small school districts in Texas receive more money because they are small. So they have fewer students enrolled and therefore receive less money, but they still have the expenses of running a school district, of having staff, of maintaining buildings, paying bills, paying utility costs, etc. So charter schools are funded at that, with the mid-size and small districts. Next slide. And also, charter schools by law are allowed to exclude students with disciplinary issues. And this priority supports a requirement that they accept all students, including students with disciplinary issues. As a result of this particular practice, and a charter doesn't have to exclude them, but they are allowed by law to exclude them. So you see fewer students with special education needs in charter schools as a result of this particular practice. Next slide. Let me mention that Gina Hinojosa has already filed a bill on that issue, and she's filed bills on that in the past. Education funding. We have 10 priorities in this particular area. The first one is also one that we came to realization on because of COVID-19 and students learning virtually as opposed to in person. So funding currently is based on average daily attendance. And there's a very complicated way that teachers who are teaching students virtually have to do to get the attendance numbers so that we get funded. So we're supporting that funding be based on enrollment rather than on attendance. And many other school districts also support this priority. We support funding to provide more appropriate funding for special education students. We spend twice as much on special education services than we receive from the state. And we oppose cuts to this foundation school program, which is a primary source for funding school districts. On recapture and fund balance. So we have received, the states have received, and we will receive more federal money due to COVID-19. And what the state has done in the past is that it has supplanted the money that it has provided to school districts with the federal money. So when the federal money goes away, the state's share has declined as a result of that, that supplanting. So we support that the money that we get from the federal government be in addition to the state's share. And then we also oppose any harmful action against school districts that maintain a fund balance. And I'm currently in the process of writing sort of a one-pager that explains what fund balance is and how we use it. Some legislators think that it's more like a savings account, and it is not. We use fund balance, for example. So districts that are recapture districts depend on property tax revenue to basically fund our schools. And we start school in August. Property tax bills don't go out till, I think, October, November, and most people don't pay their property taxes until December or January. So we have to front the front end of our school operations with money, with fund balance money. So when we do get the property tax revenue, you know, we replenish the fund balance. And the other thing that we've used fund balance for is during this pandemic on equipment, on Chromebooks, on technology, on PPE, etc. So in case of an emergency, and this is often happened in school districts that are near the coast and have hurricanes. So we really depend on the fund balance to operate our district. Next slide, please. Under local control and flexibility, this one in particular, I mentioned districts of innovation because there's been a bill filed, and there have been bills filed in the past few sessions that mandate when schools can start and when they must end the school year. And districts of innovation can accept themselves from those beginning and end dates. There's been a bill filed already that mandates a particular that school cannot start till after Labor Day, and it must end before Memorial Day. And it takes away the exception for districts of innovation to have flexibility on those dates. So we want to maintain that local control and flexibility for districts of innovation. And then we also support being able to use bond funds that we have not used in response to an emergency. So if we have bond funds remaining after a particular project, we would be able to use it, for example, in order the expenses that we've incurred dealing with COVID-19. So we would like flexibility there. Next slide. On local control and flexibility, which, you know, there have been attempts during the past sessions and probably before I even started working at AISD to limit what school districts can do. There has been bills filed in the last couple of sessions at least that would prohibit school districts, cities, counties from advocating, lobbying legislature. And they have excluded charter schools from that limitation. At the same time, the state government hires lobbyists to lobby in Washington. So, you know, a lot of school districts, you know, fortunately we are in Austin, and you know, we have access to the Capitol, we have access to our legislators, but a lot of school districts that are located in remote parts of the state depend on organizations like TASB, Texas Association of School Boards, Texas Association of School Administrators, and other associations, like there's an association of small districts, etc., to represent them at the Capitol. And these measures that have been filed would prohibit them from belonging to an organization that lobbies. And then there also have been attempts in the past few sessions to require districts to have certain language put in their bond propositions to restrict bond elections to November elections only. We're able to have them in May. We have that option. So we are concerned about those bills as well. And then we have one on transportation. Gina Hinojosa filed a bill 2 sessions ago to exempt public school buses from paying tolls for use of toll roads. And we got close on that one, but again, it was sort of late in the session, it didn't pass. And so this session, Representative Eddie Rodriguez has filed this bill. It would save us gas costs. It would save students time and traveling. It would take cars off the road. So we have submitted testimony in the past, and we're ready to go on this one. Hopefully it'll get through this time. So how does all this affect you and our community? You know, one of the reasons that sustainable funding is at the top of our list is because school districts need funds in order to operate the school district, in order to pay our salaries, in order to provide education programs and services like social and emotional learning. We have social supports like communities and schools. We have childcare centers at our high schools that allow our students who are also parents to have their children taken care of. We have parent support specialists that provide incredible support to our families. We have campus-based mental health centers, and we have many other supports for our families and our students that could be endangered if our funding is cut. We also have early college high schools, and we have several career launch programs that are great programs for our high school students. that, you know, could be endangered as well if funding is cut. Next slide. Also, we want HP3 funding to continue because we want to continue the raises and the stipends that we have given our teachers, and hopefully give them additional raises. We also have hired, you know, additional staff for special education and for dual language, pre-K, and other specialized programs. And we want to be able to continue that, and even be able to have a lower student teacher ratio if we're able to have additional staff. So it really has a big impact on the programs that we are able to offer our scholars. Next slide. So bills filed. This slide is of January 8th. I've checked mid-afternoon today, and of course those numbers have gone up. The House has filed 1,145 bills, and the Senate 322 bills. There are 24 bills that either support or relate to our priorities, and you can find that chart. I've created a chart with the priority listed in one column, and then the bills that either support or relate to it in another column. We're tracking now over 183 bills. And as I said, you can go to our website, go to the address is right there, legislature /bills, to find that particular list. I also, last session I started this because I would tell people, well, if you want to see what our priorities are, go to our website. And I realized, you know, people are too busy to go, you know, to remember to go to our website to look at this. So last session, I started sending out Friday emails to people who wanted to receive them that sort of had the latest on what's going on at the Capitol. It also had a list of the bills that support or relate to our priorities. Other interesting things that were going on at the Capitol, such as what is a blocker bill? In the Senate, they have a blocker bill, explaining what a blocker bill is. So if you want to receive these emails, send me an email at edna.butts@austinisd.org, and I'll put you on the list to receive these emails on Friday. They're not very long emails. I try to keep it short and sweet, but informative. And then you can also sign up at the legislature's website to track bills if you want to do that. We have another one of these sessions coming up on January 26th, and we're going to go through the legislative process, how it works, how you can get involved. And it's going to be very different this session because of limited access to the Capitol. A lot of legislators are not going to, it's going to be appointment only. Some are requiring COVID tests before they come in before you go in their office, etc. So I'm hoping that we'll know more about the process by the time we meet again on January 26th. So that's it, I think, yeah. So I think we have several questions in the chat, and somebody, I hope Gabriella or Allie are.
Yes. Thank you so much, Edna. I will be sharing the slides with your questions here in just a second, but I wanted to shout out and thank a few of our trustees who are on this call with us tonight. Trustees Foster, Boswell, and Singh, thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to pop in and say hi while I'm getting these next slides up.
Yes, thank you. Trustee Singh is a member of our legislative committee and worked on developing these priorities. And I had the pleasure of working with Trustee Boswell last session when she was president of ACPTA. And she did an incredible job of getting other school districts. This is the other thing about advocacy, is that we advocate to our legislators. We have 6 in the House and 3 in the Senate, but they alone can't accomplish, can't get a bill passed. So we have to expand our collaboration with other school districts that have similar priorities. And so Trustee Boswell was she got a bunch of school districts together, and they collaborated, went to the Capitol together, and it was a great collaboration. So thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us tonight, trustees. Let's go ahead and get into these questions. So starting with this question here from Lisa P. I understand the process of the Robin Hood plan and recapture, but what kind of change can we advocate for at the legislature that would keep more of our tax dollars in our own district?
I think as I mentioned when I was talking about HB3, that the state's share of education funding lowers, the more that the state puts in to support public education, the less recapture we have to pay in. So that's kind of how it works. We're not going to do away with recapture. That's never going to go away. So it's that keeping that pressure on the state to continue its share of funding public education. And then also tangential to that is basing funding on enrollment, because the more students we have enrolled, the lower our recapture payment is. So basically it's a formula of what are our property tax revenues and what's our enrollment. And as our enrollment declines and our property values increase, the more recapture we pay. We can't do very much about our property tax valuations, but hopefully we can do what we can to increase enrollment, and changing the funding based on enrollment versus ADA would be helpful.
And I saw a question just pop up in the chat related to that from Jesus Gonzalez. Can you explain a little bit more about what recapture is, like a recapture 101? Oh
God. No. Short answer is no. It's I mean, I would say this, and I'm not a school finance expert. We started this 3-part series a couple months ago with School Finance 101 with George Gorganis in our finance division. But what I know about recapture is that it was put in place because school districts like ours who have higher property values get more funding. And then there were school districts in very poor parts of the state that basically don't have that same opportunity. They don't have commerce and a lot of businesses in their communities. And so recapture was sort of born out of that necessity of the districts who have high property values and the districts that have low property values, and to try to equalize education. So recapture in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's the equalizer for all school districts in the state of Texas. It's just that it's become very perverse, and the schools and the state has relied so much more on and collected so much more in recapture, and has reduced its share as a result of collecting more in recapture. So I can't. I cannot explain sort of the little technicalities of how Recapture works, but that's sort of like a big
I think
picture.
that's great. Thank you, Edna. So on to the next one. What is the entire current 2-year budget? So at the beginning, you talked about how we're in a $1 billion deficit. Do you know what that entire current 2-year budget is?
The 2-year budget for the state of Texas? No, I don't. I could look it up, but I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head.
So the next question we have here from Amy S. is, were the stipends for special education and bilingual staff new, or was HB3 simply allowing existing stipends to continue?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I think that what we did was that the $500 stipend that I mentioned and the $1,000 stipend were in addition to any stipends we may have been paying.
All right, and from Denise K, can you explain more about HB3 and what it did for schools besides the pay raises for various staff?
Oh gosh, it did a lot. It created an allotment or extra funding for students with dyslexia. It changed the way that funding is calculated for economically disadvantaged students. It kind of created a I don't know what you call it, poverty, sort of a scaffolding of poverty levels, so that, you know, a child who's the very, very poorest schools get more money to educate that child than a student in poverty that's not as quite as dire as another level. So they looked at poverty levels and created a new system for compensating districts for those levels. Oh gosh, it did so many things. I'm happy to send you a summary of it, but you can also go to the legislative website, because I went and looked at HB3 today to refresh myself on these the raises. And if you go to the legislative website and you go to 86th regular session, you can type in HB3, and my recommendation is always to go, when you go to text, it'll let you look at the text of the bill, but you don't want to do that. It's very long. It's 100 and some pages long. Is to go to the HRO summary. HRO stands for House Research Organization, and they do a really good job of summarizing the bills in sort of plain language. So, but it did a lot of other things besides that, besides the pay raises.
Awesome, thank you. Next question from Amy S. Are charters able to exclude students with certain special education needs that don't have disciplinary issues, such as students with intellectual disabilities?
No, they're not, but I would say that no, they're not. And you know, charters are limited in the enrollment numbers, because when an organization applies to be a charter school, they define the area that they intend to serve, and the grades they intend to serve, and the enrollment capacity. So if they reach their capacity and they haven't expanded, then they can turn away students. And you've heard, you know, you've heard of waiting lists for charter schools. So they are somewhat, they can limit based on their enrollment limitations, whereas public schools cannot.
So the next question, what are the benefits of funding based on enrollment not during COVID?
So if a student, for example, is enrolled and is sick, and is going to stay home and learn from home, we would get funding for that student when that student stays home.
Great.
I mean, I think that what may come out of COVID is that we might see more of a blended model of in-person and virtual. You know, we have that at Garza High School, where students can come in person or they can choose to learn from home for 2 or 3 days a week, and they still get funded. So I can see where this is going to expand opportunities for students to not miss instruction if they have to stay home for a particular reason.
Great. So this next question is from Helen M. Helen is asking, isn't the Texas lottery money used for public education? What impact does that money have?
Yes, it is. It is dedicated to public education. I don't think it has had the impact on funding that people hoped it would have, and I don't know that it's a very large amount. I don't know what it is. But.
Great. And a question from Jesus G. What are some examples of harmful action against districts that maintain a fund balance? And how can parents support against those actions?
So there have been some discussions that if a district has a fund balance of, you know, like I just learned this afternoon that our fund balance is in the sort of the $200 million range, so that if the legislature says, all right, Austin ISD, based on your enrollment, based on your student characteristics, this is how much money you're entitled to, we're going to subtract that $220 million from the amount that we're going to appropriate, that we're going to give you. So that'd be one thing, is to subtract the money that the state owes us by the fund balance that we maintain. So that's one way. And I will, you know, I think I heard the comptroller today in a meeting say that because I think it was the comptroller who said that because the deficit is not as bad as he predicted in June, that fund balance, that this fund balance sort of punishment may not come to fruition, because there's probably going to be enough money. But if the deficit were greater, then that might be back on the table.
Great. And a question here from Mary R. In 2019, the AISD board approved the Families First expanded school hours and prioritized before and after school programming for all students. Are there any priorities around asking the legislature for additional funds to support these out of school time programs?
No, there's not. There's not a particular priority around that specifically. And I think I tried to preface my remarks at the beginning by saying that the landscape for these particular priorities were the realization that there wasn't going to be any extra money this session. In fact, there's going to be a deficit. And in the past, we have asked for money for different types of programs. This time, we didn't too much. We asked for sustainable funding for HP3. We asked for more money for special education, realizing that there's not extra money and that it would be sort of futile to ask for additional funds for additional programs. However, there is, I have to say, in HP3, they did provide funding for, I think it's an extra 30 days of summer programming. So there already is some funding for this. And by sustaining the funding for House Bill 3, we sustain the funding for that extra education in the summertime.
Great. I'm seeing a question in the chat here from Dusty H. The question is, the cost of education index was dropped in HB3. That index attempted to balance the cost of living in different areas of Texas. This is obviously an issue in Austin, as we have the highest cost of living across the state. Is there a reason that we're not prioritizing the reinstatement of that cost of education index as a legislative priority? Or rather, cost of living.
Yeah, well, so the cost of education index, Dusty, had not been updated since it was enacted by the legislature in like 1999. And we had, Austin ISD had one of the lower indexes. We had, it was lower than Brownsville. Brownsville had one of the highest. We were lower than Round Rock. We were lower than so many. And so AISD was not getting what it should have been getting had the legislature updated the cost of education index throughout the years. And so we really, by eliminating the CEI, it put more money into the pot, so to speak, the funding pot. And, you know, this is something that Nicole Connolly asked for and you know, prioritized, and we have wanted something back in the funding discussion that accounts for the cost of living, the cost of you know, the cost of supplies and so forth and so on, because we do spend more in Austin than other school districts do. That's not part of our priorities right now. I don't think the legislature would entertain. I really don't think the legislature is going to entertain many, if any, changes to the formulas, because they did so much in House Bill 3, and I think they probably don't want to mess with it.
All right, and I think we have time for a couple more questions that I saw pop up in the chat just a minute ago. We have a question from Alex C. What are the arguments or pushback against switching to enrollment-based funding rather than attendance-based?
Well, that it would cost the state more. I mean, I think that if anyone is against it, it's going to be maybe some legislators who may be concerned about how much more money they would have to provide schools.
And one more question here from Jesus G. Are there any like rules or regulations on charter schools around diversity, in particular for special education students?
Okay, I'm sorry. Say that again. I was reading the question that's on the screen, but that's not the question.
Yeah, sorry. The questions in the chat got a little ahead of the ones on the screen. I'm going to stop sharing so that's not confusing. There's a question in the chat from Jesus G. Are charter schools obligated to have any sort of minimum diversity, especially around special education students?
No, they're not. They're not. And one of the things that I have seen in reviewing some of these charter applications is that they represent in their charter application, we're going to serve X% of economically disadvantaged, X% of special education, X% of African-American students and Hispanic students, et cetera. And we're going to offer these innovative programs. And it all sounds very good. And so one of our priorities is that, well, I don't actually know if it made it to our priority list, is that before the commissioner grants an expansion to a charter school, that the commissioner should go back and look at the initial representations that the charter school made regarding those percentages and diversity of students and the programming that they say they're going to offer, to see if they indeed are doing it before they allow an expansion.
All right, and I think our last question for today comes from Trustee Singh. Could you please explain what hold harmless is and what the outlook is for extending it this semester?
So hold harmless is basically the state providing the same amount of money that it provided to us last school year. So for example, they have granted a hold harmless for this semester, which means we're getting the same amount of money based on the enrollment that we had last school year. And they've only approved it for this semester. They haven't approved it for this next semester. And that's a great question, Trustee Singh. That came up today in our Texas School Alliance meeting. I think people in the know are cautiously optimistic that it will be extended, and especially so since the comptroller issued his revised revenue estimate. So we're very, very hopeful. And one of the things that is really important to realize here is that most of our enrollment losses are in the very early grades in pre-K and K. And we don't want to lose our teachers in pre-K and K because it really is so imperative that we start kids off on the right foot early so they don't fall behind. So anyway, people are cautiously optimistic. And by the way, I also wanted to mention that we have resources on our website. It has the biennial revenue estimate the comptroller released on Monday. And then there's also a good document by the House Research Organization on the focus topics for this 87th legislature.